verbatim, he said, "Mr. Barsky, there are some doubts about your identity." I'm stoic, so my face didn't show any reaction, but my God, this was like, oh shoot. I knew I was busted. My name is Jack Barski. I had a really, really crazy life, and, I was born and raised in Germany, East Germany, 4 years after the end of World War II, and the part of Germany that I grew up in was Soviet occupied. So it became a communist country. I grew up under communism and did well in school. And I bought into communist ideology, and I was going to be a tenured professor. That was a given. That was my career because I aced everything that I took. I was going to join the intellectual elite, and then something else happened. The KGB stepped into the mix, KGB, Soviet intelligence. They reached out to me. We had an informal relationship for about 18 months until they figured out that they really had the kind of guy that they were recruiting for, and that is to become an undercover, illegal, lone wolf agent. Wound up in the United States, spent a dozen years working for the KGB, and then I quit. We can get to that. That's a key part of my life. The absolute turning point. Lived my life as a upper middle class American with a family, and then the FBI finally found me. The KGB had access to the records for a vast majority of East German citizens. The records were kept by East German intelligence, the Stasi. They were looking particularly at people who they suspected of being enemies of the state and enemies of communism. At the other end, people who would eventually rise up in society and take on, very important tasks and wind up in high-level positions. And I was a standout, as I already told you, academically, but I also was active in the communist youth movement, and I was a party member. And what was important for somebody who was looking for an individual who would go to West Germany and operate on behalf of East Germany, they couldn't have any relatives in the West. They were particularly focusing on records of students, juniors, seniors, people who they already knew were reasonably mature, but not yet settled in life. The CIA recruits the same way, by the way. On a Saturday afternoon, I was in my dorm room. A stranger came in, and he spoke German. He didn't speak with a Russian accent. And he gave me a total idiotic cover story. He said he was from an optics factory, very, very sophisticated factory that made optical instruments that could be exported to all countries in the world. That was the number one company in the town where I studied. And he wanted to know what my plans were when I'm done with my studies, after graduation. That was the dumbest part of his cover story, because he didn't even know how East Germany operated in those days. There was no recruitment at college campuses. When you were done studying, you were assigned. Okay, that was it. So I knew right away when he came up with the dumb story, my conclusion was he is Stasi, East German secret police. My conclusion was also that there was nothing for me to fear. I had done nothing wrong. I was not in the crosshairs of people who were looking for enemies of the state. So I figured it's going to be recruitment for espionage. And so I played around with him for a little bit back and forth, and then he changed his tune at one point, and he said, I have to admit something. I'm really not from that company. I work for the government. One question I have, could you imagine to one day work for the government? I could have made him really uncomfortable asking what part of the government, but I just played along. So I answered, yes, absolutely, but not as a chemist. So he got an answer to the question he didn't ask. But we had an understanding, we can talk, fundamentally. That's what I told him. I was curious. And the next week, he had invited me for a lunch, and that is where he introduced a fellow. He introduced him by the name of Hermann, which is a German name. But when Hermann opened his mouth, he spoke with a Russian accent. When he said, "This is Hermann, we're working with our Soviet comrades." And then he excused himself. So I knew I was now, interacting with somebody from the KGB. That was just like, well, let's see what happens. So for 18 months, we met once every 2 weeks. He gave me West German literature to read, which was illegal to have. And we talked about what it might be like to be a spy for the KGB in West Germany. Very light, nothing very much in detail. He gave me some tasks to do that made me somewhat uncomfortable, but I passed. He asked me to go to a particular house, ring the bell, and talk with the occupant. This family had a relative in the West who the KGB was interested in recruiting, and they wanted me to find out if and when he's going to come visit. So I had to come up with some kind of a story. I told her I'm a sociology student, and I'm doing a survey for a paper, and if she wouldn't mind answering some questions. And I had some very innocent questions, but I was clever enough. This was the whole purpose of me doing this. She disclosed everything that I wanted to know. That impressed Herman, and then gave me a couple of other tasks. It took 18 months until, I guarantee you, he took notes. Every time when we talked, he took notes, and may have shared this at the time with the head of the KGB, or the headquarters of the KGB in East Berlin. Somehow, somebody eventually made a decision. It's time to make me an offer. You think they told me that this was going to happen? No. Herman told me I was going to Berlin for a week to get some better training than what he could provide. Spycraft. I never questioned anything. I never asked questions, why, what. I figured out that questions were not a good idea to ask. Because one time I asked Herman, I asked him whether his real name was German, which is the Russian version of Herman. And he got really ticked off. He got angry. So the next to last day of my stay in Berlin, my handler in Berlin took me to the KGB headquarters, went down a long hallway and entered an office that was extremely richly furnished. So I knew I was in the office of somebody high up. And there was a desk behind which sat a really short guy. You saw maybe this much from my hand up of this guy. The desk was huge. But the moment that the fellow opened his mouth and he spoke only Russian, I went like internally, not physically. I went like, whoa. Steely voice, strong psychological presence. And he started, like the German idiot that first had contact with me, with some small talk. And I'm thinking, why am I here? The answer came very quickly when he, like the German, radically changed his tune. Out of the blue, he said, so can we count on you? I was not expecting this. I had never, at that point, seriously considered leaving this promising career that I had, the town where I lived that had become my hometown, and my new family, which was my basketball team. Basketball was my number one passion in those days. And what I didn't know what was going to happen if I joined the KGB, that was the unknown. So I stalled. I couldn't give an answer. I said, I don't know if I'm qualified, and I don't have enough training. And this fellow said, don't worry, in a steely voice, don't worry. We know that you're qualified, and we will train you. We are looking for people who can make important decisions very quickly, so you got until tomorrow noon to give me the answer. Guess how well I slept that night? Not. This was like, it's like a crossroads. And you have to take one of the paths. I was at that time, I could have said no, because nobody pressurizes somebody to do this kind of a job. You need volunteers. Because if they had forced me, first chance I would have gotten, I would have defected, right? I pretty much knew, based on what I knew about espionage, that I had a choice. Eventually, my sense of adventure, being flattered, my ego getting a huge boost by being recruited by the most powerful intelligence agency on the planet, and the knowledge that I would live sort of a dream life as somebody who does really good work and tries to defeat the Nazis that were still in West Germany, having a real purpose in life, and lived a good life on top of it. I was told that one of my tasks was to do a lot of reading about West Germany, do a lot of reading about the history of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, study the West German Constitution, watch a lot of West German television, and also go attend concerts, classical music, theater. So I would become an interesting person to interact with. So one day, it was maybe 1 year into my training in Berlin, I had a visitor from Moscow. We talked a little bit about this, that, and the other, and that it was getting pretty close to my deployment. And then he asked, so how's your English? And I pulled a novel, English novel, out of my bookshelf, and I said, I can read that without a dictionary. Something must have happened in this guy's brain, because he was thinking, whoa. A week later, my handler in Berlin by the name of Nikolai gave me a recording device, tape recorder. And I was told, just, spend 15, 20 minutes and talk about anything you want to talk about. Talk freely about whatever topic. A week later, I was on a plane to Moscow. They must have listened to that tape and they said, wow, we got talent here. And within couple of weeks, I was on a plane to Moscow again, but this one was a move. And this is where I spent 2 years language training and enhancing my overall spy skills. As a result, I most likely became the best trained agent that they ever sent to the West, because the base training in Berlin was a little over 2.5 years. And then I was going to go. I had a total of 5 years before I was launched to the U.S. The sleeper agent aspect, we never discussed. I wasn't even told I was going to be a sleeper. We sleeper agents were insurance policies, because all the other agents that the KGB had in the United States, they were under diplomatic cover. And during the height of the Cold War, there was a spy war going on, and agent diplomats on both sides were kicked out of the country. Eventually, there was a high risk that diplomatic relations would be broken off, and then the KGB would have had no representation in the United States other than the sleepers who they were going to wake up. I found that out afterwards. I didn't know that. What they told me my task was, number one, that was clear to me, become a fully integrated United States citizen with legal documentation. We had a plan how to do that. Then number two, get to know decision makers in foreign policy, or influencers at least, with regard to foreign policy. And number three, get to know as many people as possible and profile them with the angle of whether they would be targets for recruitment. I knew about the foreign policy. I knew about getting to know people. I didn't know about the sleeper thing. I used to live in Atlanta, and Atlanta has this huge aquarium, like maybe 10 feet tall and very wide, and they have all kinds of fish swimming around there. And I found myself just being fascinated by watching these fish. But watching them, did that teach me how to be a fish? No, of course not. So, and those diplomats that were trying to teach me how to be an American, they didn't live like Americans. They had interaction with Americans, but they looked at American society from the outside in. So whatever they tried to teach me was either wrong or outright dangerous. How they told me how to go about to get U.S. documents, particularly a driver's license and a social security card, so I could live and work like an American. None of that worked. My integration was a lengthy process, and you got to give them credit. They recruited the right guy. When they profiled me, they knew that I would be able to make up, find my own way, whatever it was. And that took, I'd say, a total of about 6 years for me to be comfortable having personal relationships with Americans when I was 100% comfortable was when I had my first job in an insurance company. Wasn't quite 100% because my German communication style was still with me. And Germans are finger pointers. Not necessarily, they don't necessarily using the finger, but they are very aggressive also in your face, and they will tell you their truth as they know it, whether you like to hear it or not. And then one day a friend of mine, a Cuban national who had immigrated from Cuba, took me aside. He's still a good friend. And he told me, you're really a good guy to work with. You're smart. I like your energy. And then he said, but you don't have to act like an a-hole. Then he explained to me that I was so argumentative. When I asked him a question, and that was my way of quote-unquote active listening, I sort of questioned what he had just told me. Okay, and he considered this an argument. That's like a German communication style. And so as I was thinking about it, I said, oh, okay. So I was a whole lot more careful. And nowadays, I don't stick out like that. Plan A was brilliant. I had a birth certificate of Jack Barski. There was a copy. It was a certified copy of the Jack Barski birth certificate, who had passed away at the age of 11. And somehow a KGB agent was able to get a hold of a non-forged. It was a genuine birth certificate of Jack Barski. I brought that with me to the United States, and then I was able to get a driver's license and a Social Security card. And the plan was for me then get a job, obviously, work in that job for a while, and apply for a passport. Get a job, also get an apartment. I think you need to have proof of residence when you apply for a passport. Well, I made a mistake, and I think they made a mistake to send me to the passport office in person, because most likely the agents there were more qualified than the agents that sit in the post office. So I went to the counter there and put my documents and the filled out application, and I gave that to the agent. And he asked me to, wait for a little while he was studying the stuff. And then he called me back and he said, these words I remember verbatim. He said, Mr. Barski, there are some doubts about your identity. I'm stoic, so my face didn't show any reaction, but my God, this was like, oh, shoot. But then he said something that gave me hope. He said, here's a questionnaire, fill that out. It's an additional questionnaire, so we can erase my doubts. And the first question, when I went back to the room and was still confident I could pass this, because I had a backstory. First question, where did you go to high school? I knew I was busted, because in my backstory, there was another mistake. The high school that I was supposed to have attended was Peter Stuyvesant, still exists, is New York City for the highly gifted. There was no chance that a Jack Barski, which is a relatively rare name, had attended Peter Stuyvesant. So again, I was very quick reacting to a situation that should have gotten me busted. So I made a decision on the way. I walked back to the counter and I mumbled I was loud, and I mumbled some bad words that I don't want to repeat in this interview. Fainting anger, who needs this? I don't need to go through all this. I noticed that the agent had my documents and the application still in front of him. So I grabbed this stuff and walked out. So plan A would have worked, and I tell you how it would have worked. The plan was to, with that passport, move to a German-speaking country like Austria or Switzerland, open some kind of business. The KGB was very good at money laundering. So they would have funneled a bunch of, quite a bit of money into that company. And then 2-3 years later, I show up in the United States with all that money, would have been able to get access to the upper echelons of society, right? So, and in that case, I could have joined a country club where I knew that there were people from the State Department, and, make friends. I would have become a very, very dangerous agent because I had no flags associated with me. I didn't come from another country. The other illegals, almost all of them that I know of, were smuggled into the United States by gaining citizenship in a third country such as Brazil and Canada, and then legally coming into the U.S. But a background check would show that they had come from another country. My background check, that's why would have yielded nothing. Plan B was to study, get a degree, get a job on Wall Street, get wealthy that way. Well, I overrode that. When I took my first class in college, I had to take an intro to computers. I had to learn a computer language and a programming language. And my scientific self, my math self, loved it. So I decided to change my major, and I told them that, and they said, "Oh, that's okay. That'll be good too." So they started really trusting me to make the right decisions. Nobody ever quits the KGB. I live life as an American. I now have a job as a programmer. I need to operate like a normal person. I need to, socialize with people, particularly colleagues, and I need to be known as somebody who may have a girlfriend, right? I found myself a girlfriend through an ad in the Village Voice. I met a very nice-looking lady from Guyana, and so we dated. But one day she asked me if I could marry her. I said, "What? Marry? I'm not really interested in marriage." And she said, "Well, I'm illegal in the country, and the only way to get a green card for me to..." She worked a job as an illegal, operated as a nurse's aide. She told me that she already paid an American citizen money to marry her, and he took the money and ran. So that made me, I had pity on her. I really wanted to help her out. She was a sweet girl. And I did some research, and I also spoke with a friend of hers who went through that process, so I knew what to expect. There was not as much of a danger of being asked the question that the guy at the passport office asked. They would ask different questions. They would take the two applicants into separate rooms and ask them the same question. So what does your living room look like? What kind of a TV shows do you watch together? And that kind of stuff. Well, I figured we can prepare for that. By the time that interview happened, we didn't need to be interviewed because Penelope, that is her name, got pregnant on purpose, and she was visibly pregnant. So for her to get the green card was a piece of cake. So all of a sudden, I'm now a father in the United States. And I didn't have enough money to take care of both of these ladies, the girl and the mother, and have them live in their own separate apartment. So we moved in together, and that is when my change started. I now was the father of a little girl, and I watched this girl on a daily basis. I watched this girl grow up, and she was all smiles, and she had these beautiful big eyes and curly hair, and without being aware of it, I fell in love with this little girl radically. You know what? Unconditional love is the only true love, when you love somebody and you never want anything back. So that leads up to the moment when I had to make a decision. She was 18 months old in December of 1988. I was on my way to work, and we had a signal system where KGB agents and I could communicate via some basic signals. And the signals were to be placed at spots where either the KGB guy or I would pass by every day on our way to work. So mine was on a support beam of the elevated subway A train that was elevated in that section of Queens, New York. So routinely, I would always look at that spot, and there was never a signal, except for this one day. And that signal screamed at me. It was the only signal that was loud. It was a red dot, big red dot, and that screamed danger. All the other signals were white chalk marks. Hit me like a ton of bricks, because what that really said, based on the protocol that we had, if the danger signal appears, you got to leave the country immediately, because we have reason to believe that you are in danger and that we don't want you to be arrested. And I just ignored it. I was numb. I didn't think anything through. I was just continuing my way to work. And I was sitting there all day in my cubicle staring at the computer screen, couldn't work. But I was thinking about what to do, and I knew I had some time. I didn't know how much, but I was trying to figure out still, I knew I had to go back one day. That was part of the plan. And I actually had a German family back there, but I knew that everything that was good for me personally was back on the other side of the Iron Curtain, which the Berlin Wall was still up. I had received the second highest decoration of the Soviet Union 2 years before that event. The second highest decoration of the Soviet Union, that was given only to superstars out of the KGB. I didn't know it when I got it, but I found it out via research. But I knew I was going to go back to $1 savings, a family with a wife and a kid. They even had promised me a house. I would have joined the elite in East Germany, and I would have had the best life ever. But then there was this girl, and I was trying to figure out how can I support her and her mother so they don't have to wind up in the projects, in a slum. I couldn't find anything. I couldn't ask an American for help, and I certainly couldn't ask the KGB for help. I got a radiogram every Thursday night. I had to listen to shortwave radio to see if there was a message for me, and there was a message. And in the message, it was pretty short. Emergency protocol, in effect, get out of the country as quickly as possible. We have reason to believe that you will be arrested soon by the FBI. Then one morning, it was still dark. There was this fellow I was waiting for the train. There weren't a lot of people on the platform at the time. It was quite early. They knew which way I took to work. That was a requirement. I don't know. He must have waited for me someplace lurking in the shadows to see when I entered the subway. I had to go up the stairs. I was waiting there, and this short man in a black trench coat shows up next to me, and he whispers into my ear, "You got to come back or else you're dead," in a heavy Russian accent. You sort of had to take that seriously, even though it could have easily been because the guy didn't know to use the right words. But I knew that if they had interpreted my reluctance to go back as a defection, my life would have been in danger, because I knew that. This was out in the public realm in East Germany because, the KGB wanted to scare people. They didn't like defectors, ha. So now I knew that they knew that I existed, so I couldn't stall anymore. It was, I think, the next day I listened to the radio again, and they asked me to collect money, travel money, documentation that would allow me to go to Canada, because I couldn't go with Jack Barsky if I was on the investigation. And I had reserved documents, but they didn't know that I could still find them. The operation was to take place in a park on Staten Island in the dark, but I wasn't afraid of the dark. The very spot I had selected, you couldn't miss it. I could not miss it, and my partner couldn't have missed it either. It was at the bottom of a tree that was hollowed out, and the container, the oil can, was supposed to be put into that hollow space. Even in the dark, you can't miss this. And it was December. There was nobody in the park. You can't even walk around with a flashlight. I go there, and I hadn't made up my decision. I was going for sure to take the money, but I still didn't know what to do next. So I went. It was about a couple of 100 feet, and there was no oil can. I turned the lights on, the flashlight. There was no oil can. I walked around in circles to see maybe he just accidentally dropped it someplace else. 15 minutes, there's no oil can. I knew there was a failure. I no idea why this failed, and maybe the guy kept the money for himself. That's the only thing that I could come up with. So I walk out of the park, and as I exit the park, at the very edge of the park, my subconscious fed me 3 words: I am staying. That was the dumbest decision I ever made. Based on logic, right? It was the dumbest decision that I could have made, because I could have been arrested, and if not, I could have been subject to assassination. But, love conquers all. I did what I could do to figure out whether I'm being followed by the FBI, and my counter-surveillance skills showed me I was not. I sent a goodbye letter to the KGB because I wanted them to understand that I was not defecting, that I was quitting. And in that letter, I told them, I appreciate your concern about me, but I really, really can't come because I'm infected with HIV/AIDS. And the United States may well be the only country where I could get treatment. In those days, there was no treatment for AIDS. There was a death sentence. And I knew that they were very, very, very much afraid of letting people into the Soviet Union that were infected with AIDS. So I hoped that they would buy into that lie, because they really didn't have a good reason for me to think that I made that up, right? So there was logic behind it, but I never knew whether they would actually believe it. So I made sure that for close to 3 months, I made sure that I was not reliably at the same spot at the same time, because typically assassinations are prepared, because the guy who will shoot you also needs to have a way to leave. And so they need to know the spot where they're going to do the hit job. Nothing ever showed up. There was no sign that anything was wrong. And so after this 3 months, I told Penelope, she always wanted to live in a house. And I said to her, no, I don't like it. I don't want to, blah, blah, blah. I said, hey, it's time to save for a house. And a year later, we moved into our first home in the suburbs. I had successfully quit the KGB. And, the personnel records that are kept in Germany, even today, have my German name. Albrecht Dittrich passed away in 1988. I was going to go totally private. I knew I would never go see Germany again. I knew I most likely would have a good career. We had another child, and things looked pretty good. And I replaced my communist ideology with consumerism. My career exploded. I made really good money. I knew also I would never apply for a passport, so I would stay in the United States, and that was okay with me. Well, there was something else that happened that I had no control over that changed my life radically one more time and is responsible for me becoming a public figure and talking to you. For me to stay private was not possible, because the head archivist for the KGB, for the first directorate, espionage, actually was a mole. He cooperated with British intelligence, and he disclosed my name to British intelligence. And that's how the FBI found me. And that's how I cooperated with the FBI, eventually became a citizen. And then CBS 60 Minutes found me, and I gave an interview, and all of a sudden I was all over the public realm. I wrote a book, and I'm out there doing public speaking. And I loved the way this all transpired, because this was the best way of living out my life, period.